Herbert. Thank you very much, Sir David. I have been a member of this House for 14 years, and interestingly, for the first decade in which I was a member, school funding wasn't particularly an issue in my constituency. The debates that we had with the local education authority, West Sussex County Council, were rather more about standards. And that perhaps isn't surprising, because funding per pupil overall in this country rose considerably over that period and reached a peak in 2015 and is 60% higher than it was in the year 2000. So overall, until 2015, there had been a very big increase in spending per pupil. However, from that period onwards, although overall funding was being increased for schools, costs were rising faster, and some of those have been alluded to in this debate. And that drew the attention of schools in my constituency to the fact that the county is actually the worst funded of county education authorities, the third worst funded education authority in the whole country. And it's no surprise that there have been three members from West Sussex who have contributed in this debate today. And all of us would accept that there are other areas of the country where needs are considerably higher. I represent an affluent rural constituency. I have honourable friends in West Sussex who have urban areas in their constituency where needs are much higher than mine. But nevertheless, the inequity, the gap, is very large, and spending per pupil in other areas of the country is between 50 and 70% higher in some cases than in West Sussex. So we were strong supporters of a national fair funding formula and benefited from the change. West Sussex in 2017 received an extra £28 million through the national funding formula. That was an increase in 6.5% in its provision, and it went more than halfway towards what the F40 campaign estimated we needed to redress funding. Nevertheless, the rising costs continue to outstrip the income that was provided. The formula was adjusted by the County Council to give more help to primary schools, some of which actually lost under that formula, and less help to secondaries. And some of the secondary schools in my constituency face deficit budgets and are very concerned about the situation going forward. I think that there is an issue about whether the formula actually recognises the basic costs which any school needs in order to run the school, and everyone then accepts that additional costs. I'll give way to the Honourable Lady.
I thank him for giving way and emphasising the importance of per-pupil funding. In Newcastle, per-pupil funding has gone down by £240 per head since 2010. Does he recognise that someone like me who grew up on free school meals and went to a state school, that the capacity of those who have lower incomes to do well when funding cuts are made is less, and that the resources of parents, the pressure put on parents to make up for those funding cuts is higher and cannot be met?
Yes, and I already said so. We would all recognise that there are areas of the country where the needs are much greater and the spending needs are therefore greater too. The point I'm making is that I think all schools need a basic minimum. And in the last couple of years, West Sussex schools and some of the schools in my constituency have struggled to make ends meet because that minimum hasn't been reached. And since their funding was at the lowest level per pupil anyway across the whole country, it's much harder for them to make savings. In arguing for the national funding formula, we never sought to take money away from other schools. What we wanted was fair funding for our area, and it is much harder to introduce a national funding formula in an environment where spending isn't rising very sharply. I would just make a couple of points finally. In the last budget, there were a number of areas in relation to public services that benefited considerably from big increases in spending, notably, of course, the National Health Service. There was also additional money for defence and for social care. Resources are finite, and any government has to make a choice about how it's going to allocate resources going forward. That's exactly what the spending review will be about. But I think that there is a case to be made for ensuring that the education budget does not fall in real terms, even if those falls are actually not quite as catastrophic as has been made out. Spending per pupil is actually the highest in the UK of any G7 country for primary and secondary schools. But if adjustments are allowed to happen where budgets which are already tight receive less money, the only way that a lot of these schools can make savings is by losing people, and that's not something that we want.